The morning after the board voted no, I drove down to my grandfather's dam and stood there in the early quiet with my coffee going cold in my hand. Not because I was angry. Because I was done being angry. Anger is what I had been carrying for 4 months while the HOA president mocked my repair estimates and sent me fine notices and tried to have my property condemned. What I had that morning was something different, something engineers are familiar with. It's called a conclusion. The conclusion was simple: $64,000 in repairs, 112 lakefront homes, property values ranging from $600,000 to $1.4 million per house. An HOA president named Diane Wexler, who had stood in front of the entire board and said, with a smile that was designed to make me feel small, that my deteriorating infrastructure was my problem and mine alone. She was technically correct about the ownership. What she had failed to understand was the implication. If the dam was my problem, then so was everything downstream. I placed my hand on a valve that hadn't been moved since my grandfather installed it in 1959. I didn't open it, not that morning. Instead, I turned around, drove back to my house, and called my property attorney. The call lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, I understood something that Diane Wexler had never thought to find out before she said no. She had no idea what she had refused. Tell me where you're watching from, then stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through is the most methodical, most legally documented, most personally satisfying resolution to a property dispute I have ever been involved in. And I have been involved in a few. My name is Ellis Hartman. I'm 53 years old. I spent 22 years working as a civil engineer specializing in hydraulic infrastructure before the dissolution of my business. Partnership and the simultaneous dissolution of my marriage created the kind of financial and personal reset that teaches you very quickly which things in your life you actually own and which things you only believed you owned. What I owned was 63 acres in the foothills of western North Carolina, and the earthen dam my grandfather Walter Hartman had constructed in 1959 at the age of 41, 2 years after returning from Korea, as a project he said would outlast everything he built with his hands. He was right. He died in 1991. The dam is still standing. For now. The lake exists because of the dam. That is not poetry. That is hydrology. Without the structure my grandfather built, without the spillway he reinforced in 1974, without the drainage system he engineered before the neighborhood surrounding the lake had a name, there is no Lakewood Ridge. There is a creek and some expensive property that isn't worth what the people who live on it paid for it. I had understood this in the abstract when I inherited the land. I understood it in concrete terms in March of this year when a structural engineer named Dr. Patricia Schoen ran 3 days of core samples on the spillway and produced a 42-page report that contained one number I could not stop thinking about: $64,200. Emergency reinforcement. The seepage had been quiet and systematic for years, finding its way through gaps in the mortar that no one walking past the dam would notice unless they knew what they were looking at. I knew what I was looking at. The report used measured language to describe what might happen if the repairs were delayed, the kind of language engineers use when they want the reader to understand the severity without inducing panic. I brought 3 bound copies of the report to the HOA board meeting in April. Diane Wexler had been president of the Lakewood Ridge HOA for 7 years. I knew this from the community website, which featured a photo of her at the annual Lake Festival in the kind of outfit that communicates a specific relationship with being photographed. She managed the board with an efficiency that long-term residents described as controlling and newer residents described as organized, depending on how recently they had been on the wrong side of one of her decisions. Her husband Richard was a commercial real estate investor with significant holdings in the Lakewood area, including 3 lakefront properties that he had purchased as investment units and rented at rates that depended entirely on the lake being full, clear, and accessible. I am telling you this not to characterize Diane uncharitably, but to establish what she had at stake in the decision she was about to make. She had everything to gain from the dam being maintained. She had simply decided that she had nothing to lose by making someone else pay for it. The board meeting was a Tuesday. The community center smelled like old coffee and new carpet. The particular combination of institutional spaces where decisions with real consequences get made without enough deliberation. I presented the report, I explained the findings. I proposed cost sharing as the most equitable resolution, a maintenance assessment distributed across the 112 households whose property values depended on the lake's existence. My per household number came to $573. One-time assessment, cheaper than 1 month of property tax for every lakefront home in the development. Diane listened with the expression of someone who has already decided and is waiting politely for you to finish speaking. When I concluded, she opened her mouth and produced the 6 words that set in motion everything that followed. That's your structure and your expense. The vote was 4-1. The one dissenting vote came from a board member named Tom Albright, who caught my eye on the way out with the apologetic expression of a person who understands he is on the wrong side of a decision but lacks the standing to change it. I thanked them for their time and drove home. My attorney's name is Carolyn Burke. She practices property rights law out of Asheville and has, over a 20-year career, developed a particular expertise in situations where rural landowners and HOA organizations discover that their understanding of who owns what is not as settled as either party assumed. I explained the situation to Carolyn. She asked me 2 questions. First, had my grandfather ever formally signed an acceptance of the HOA's covenants and conditions? Second, was there any documentation attached to the original deed regarding the community's use of the lake? I did not know the answer to either question. My grandfather's papers were in 3 boxes in my attic that I had not fully inventoried since inheriting them. I spent the following weekend going through them with the systematic attention of a man who suddenly understands that every document in those boxes might matter. The answer to Carolyn's first question was in a letter from 1971. An HOA attorney had written to my grandfather requesting his formal acceptance of the community covenants that governed the properties surrounding the lake. My grandfather had not responded to the letter. He had, however, written a single sentence on the back of the envelope in the dense, precise handwriting of someone who had spent considerable time with engineering documents. The sentence read, "Not my obligation to their organization." He had never signed. The answer to Carolyn's second question was in a separate document filed with the original deed in 1959. My grandfather, building a dam on private land that would create a lake used by an entire community, had been thoughtful enough to formalize the terms of that use. The document was titled Grant of Water Use Privilege, and it established that adjacent property holders were granted permission to use the lake and its amenities for residential and recreational purposes, subject to one condition. The language was plain. Continuation of the privilege was contingent upon reasonable participation in the maintenance of the dam and associated water control structures by the community benefiting from said structures. Carolyn read the document for approximately 90 seconds and then said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Your grandfather built you a key. The question is whether you're willing to use it. The key was a revocation clause. My grandfather had not simply granted the community use of the lake, he had granted conditional use, with the explicit right of revocation by the property owner in the event that the community failed to contribute to reasonable maintenance costs. He had written this in 1959. He had filed it with the county. It had been sitting in the public record for 64 years, available to anyone who looked, and Diane Wexler had made her decision without ever looking. Carolyn drafted the revocation notice over the following week. It was precise and civil and devastating. It stated that the HOA's refusal to contribute to documented emergency repair costs constituted a failure of the condition under which the water use privilege had been granted, and that as the legal property holder, I was hereby exercising my right to revoke that privilege. The revocation would take effect 30 days from filing. We filed it with the county recorder on a Thursday morning. I will tell you honestly that I stood outside the county building for a few minutes after we filed, not celebrating, not second-guessing, just sitting with the weight of what had just happened. Somewhere in those 64 years, the document my grandfather had written had been waiting for exactly this use. He had understood something about the nature of shared resources that the community had not. That dependency requires acknowledgement. That benefit requires participation. That you cannot accept the gift and refuse the cost indefinitely. The notice was a matter of public record by Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, Diane Wexler's attorney had called Carolyn. The 30-day period was the most instructive month I have spent in any property dispute. It revealed, in sequence, Every stage of a powerful person's response to losing leverage they didn't know they had. Stage 1 was dismissal. Diane's attorney filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, arguing that my revocation was an abuse of property rights. The motion was denied within 4 business days. The judge's written response was brief and contained the phrase, "The grantor's revocation right is expressly documented and legally unambiguous." Stage 2 was negotiation from a position of denial. Diane offered me $15,000 and a formal apology. $15,000 against $64,000 in repairs and $18,000 in legal fees. I asked Carolyn to acknowledge receipt and decline. Stage 3 was public pressure. The Lakewood Ridge Next Door Forum became, for approximately 10 days, a remarkable document of how communities respond when they realize that something they took for granted might not exist. There were threads analyzing the revocation notice. There were threads questioning my motives. There were threads, and these were the ones that told me the most about how the situation was being understood, questioning why the board had voted the way it had. The tone of these last threads was not friendly toward Diane. Stage 4 was private contact. On a Thursday evening of the 3rd week, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The man who identified himself was not Diane. It was her husband, Richard. He said he was calling on his own without Diane's knowledge. He said he wanted to understand what it would take to resolve the situation before the 30 days expired. I told him the same thing I had told the board in April. Pay the full repair cost. Cover the legal fees, authorize it through a formal board vote. He asked if I understood how much this had already cost the community in property value. Several listings had been pulled pending resolution of the water rights uncertainty. 2 completed sales had fallen through. I told him yes. I told him I had understood exactly what the revocation would cost since the morning after the board meeting, when I sat with my coffee and did the arithmetic. I had not wanted to use that arithmetic. The board had made that choice for me. He said he would speak with Diane. The lake dropped 4 inches in the first week of controlled outflow. I had not waited for the conversation with Richard to begin the process. The 30 days had expired on a Monday. On Monday morning, I had opened the spillway valve to 20% and watched the water begin its slow, honest departure. The physics of a draining lake are not dramatic on any individual day. What they are is cumulative and undeniable. The water level drops an inch, then 2. The dock floats lower against its mooring lines, and then, when the lines go slack, simply sits. The boats lean slightly. The shoreline expands outward in an irregular ring of exposed mudflat and rock that has not seen sunlight in decades. The smell arrives before the visual, that particular combination of anaerobic sediment and disturbed organic material that tells you something that was always underwater is now not. By the end of the first full week, the water had dropped 14 inches. Enough for casual observation. Enough for the community to understand that this was not a natural fluctuation. I had been methodical in my preparation. I had contacted the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission before beginning the drawdown and established a fish relocation protocol. I had a portable holding system for the bass and bluegill populations. I was not a man trying to harm a lake. I was a man exercising a documented property right in a way that respected the other living things affected by it. That distinction mattered to me, and as Carolyn pointed out, it would matter in any subsequent legal proceeding. I had also contacted a journalist at a regional environmental and property rights publication who had been covering HOA water disputes for several years. I did not give her the story. I gave her my timeline and my documentation and told her that if she wanted to understand what was happening at Lakewood Ridge, the county recorder's files were public record. She filed her first piece the day after the drawdown began. The emergency board meeting was called 9 days into the drawdown. Diane sent the notice herself, framing it as a community safety discussion. The community center held 108 people. I know this because the fire marshal counted on his way in. I was not planning to speak first. I had prepared remarks, but I assumed I would be responding to Diane's presentation. What I did not anticipate was that Diane would not speak at all. She arrived. She sat at the front table. She looked at the room. And then she stayed very quiet, because the room, before the meeting was formally called to order, had already begun the conversation without her. A man near the back asked why the board had rejected a documented repair request in April. A woman near the middle asked why no one had informed the community that the lake operated under a conditional use privilege that could be revoked. A board member named Sandra, who I had not previously met, stated clearly into the room that she had voted against the repair rejection, that she had raised concerns at the time, and that she believed the community deserved to understand how the decision had been made and who had made it. Tom Albright, the one dissenting vote from April, stood and confirmed Sandra's account. He described the April meeting. He described the tone in which Diane had delivered her ruling. He said he had voted no then and would not be making the same mistake in any subsequent vote. I stood when the room was ready to hear something methodical rather than emotional. I kept my remarks brief. I said I was Ellis Hartman. I said I owned the property the dam sat on and that my grandfather had built that dam 6 years before the first house in Lakewood Ridge had a foundation. I said I had asked for help maintaining a shared resource in April and been told it was not the community's concern. I said I had then done what property owners do when their rights are not acknowledged, which is to exercise them. I said I did not want an empty lake. I had never wanted that. I wanted the same thing I had wanted in April, which was a functional dam and a shared understanding that shared resources require shared maintenance. The motion to authorize full payment of the repair costs and legal fees was made by Sandra and seconded by Tom. The vote was 103-5. Diane voted no, Richard voted no, 3 of their allies voted no, everyone else voted yes. Diane did not leave the room dramatically. She stayed through the end of the meeting, which I thought showed a certain resilience, and then walked to her car in the parking lot and drove home without speaking to anyone. The repairs were completed in September, 6 weeks before the first frost. Dr. Patricia Schoen, who had written the original assessment, supervised the work and signed the completion certification. The spillway concrete was reinforced, regrouted, and waterproofed. The mortar joints were restored. A secondary inspection by the North Carolina Dam Safety Program gave the structure a clean bill of health with a recommendation for 5-year maintenance reviews. The lake refilled by early October. The water came back quietly, the way water does when it's returning to where it belongs, rising inch by inch against the shoreline until the mudflats were covered and the docks were level and the boats were floating correctly. The smell resolved itself within 2 weeks. The bass and bluegill populations were returned to the lake under the Wildlife Commission's supervision and appeared to adapt immediately, which the Commission's contact described to me as unsurprising. Fish understand their own water. The Lakewood Ridge Dam Maintenance Fund was established in November at a $220 per household annual assessment. It was formalized through a community vote of 97-8 and incorporated into the HOA's governing documents with the specific requirement that dam maintenance costs could not be rejected by board vote without a full community referendum. Tom Albright wrote the language. Sandra reviewed it. Carolyn certified that it was legally sound. I converted 3 acres of woodland around the dam's perimeter into a permanent conservation easement. The land will not be developed. It will remain forested and accessible as public green space in perpetuity. I registered it under the county's Open Space Protection Program. My grandfather's name is on the trailhead sign. Diane Wexler sold her house the following spring and relocated to Charleston. The listing did not mention the water rights dispute, though by that point the lake was full and the certified repair documentation had resolved the title uncertainty that had pulled buyers from 2 transactions. Her husband Richard kept his 3 investment properties. He and I are not friends, but we have had 2 cordial conversations at community events. He understands what happened. I believe he understood it before Diane did, which is why he made the call in week 3. Carolyn Burke tells me she has received inquiries from 5 other communities since the Lakewood Ridge case received regional coverage, all involving dam or water infrastructure disputes where the underlying ownership question had never been fully examined. In 3 of those cases, documents similar to my grandfather's conditional use grant were found in original deed filings. In 2 of those cases, the disputes were resolved through negotiation before any drawdown occurred. I started consulting on exactly these situations the following year, working with rural communities across the western part of the state where aging private infrastructure and unclear maintenance responsibilities had been building toward conflicts for decades. The work is methodical, document-heavy, and occasionally involves delivering information to HOA boards that they would have preferred to have received earlier. Most of them, when they understand what they are looking at, choose resolution over escalation. Some of them do not. Those cases proceed along the path that Lakewood Ridge took. The outcomes tend to be similar, because the underlying math is the same everywhere. My daughter visits most weekends during the summer. We sit on the dock in the evenings and watch the light move across the water, the same light my grandfather must have watched in 1959 when the lake was filling for the first time and he was the only person who understood what he had built. She asked me once whether I had been afraid, when I opened the spillway and heard the water begin to move. I told her that an engineer isn't afraid of systems he understands. What I had felt was more like sadness that it had been necessary. Sadness that a $573 assessment had become a $64,000 emergency repair and an $18,000 legal battle and 14 inches of exposed lake bed and 2 canceled property sales and 3 months of community anxiety. All of it avoidable, every single consequence avoidable. If one person had looked at the repair estimate in April and done the arithmetic before saying no. The dam is solid now. The water is full. The community maintains what it depends on. My grandfather built better than he knew. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Drop your own in the comments. HOA disputes, property rights misunderstandings. The moment you discovered that the documents in the attic mattered more than anyone realized. I read every one. The lake is still there. It always will be, as long as the people who use it remember who built the dam that holds it.